Welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And the top topic in the news is frequently, and now as well, the economy. Tonight we'll be talking with Dr. Bill Barclay, a founding member of the Chicago Political Economy Group, about just what's going on in the economy, what's up with unemployment, and how we might take some steps to remedy the situation that we still find ourselves in. Bill, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me again. I always enjoy it.
Well, let's start with giving our audience a little bit of background about the Chicago Political Economy Group. What is it and how did it get started? What's the point of it?
Okay, the group, and I'm going to call it CPEG because we always call it CPEG. It actually came out of a study group that existed quite a few years ago at Roosevelt University. But a few years ago, several of us in the group decided that we wanted to speak to people in non-economic jargon. We actually thought that we might have something to say about policy and about people's lives. So we turned it into CPEG, or Chicago Political Economy Group, cpegonline.org. And we started first with work on jobs. We created a jobs program, which I think I've talked to you about once before on the show. And our goal remains to get as much stuff out into the public media as we can to help people think about the economy. For example, every first Friday of the month, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases its unemployment report, we're the economists who work with Job with Justice to do a commentary at the rallies downtown on what the latest report means, what the trends are, et cetera. In addition to the jobs program, we've done some analysis of trade. We've held a couple of conferences in conjunction with Howard University down in Washington. So we're just out there talking to people and talking to various groups. We have an economic crisis workshop that you can either have one of us run or you can take it off the web and run it yourself.
Economic crisis, not in how to create one, but how to deal with
how
one
we
that
got
to be
into the mess that we are in and how we might get out of it.
So speaking of the crisis that we are still in, now, depending on who you talk to, the news media would seem to feel that the crisis is over, that the economy is rebounding, growth is happening once again, the stock market is up. What's really happening? Is that really the full picture?
Well, just officially, the Great Recession ended in June of 2009. The National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the entity that says when things start, when they end in terms of recession, said that's the end of it. We're 21 months after that, and at this point we still have 6.5 million fewer people with jobs than we did at the beginning of the Great Recession, 500,000 fewer people with jobs than we did at the official end of the Great Recession. So by that measure, which is the measure I think that impacts most people and actually impacts the economy over the long run,
so
we're not out of it.
We have fewer jobs than we had at the end, the official end of the recession.
Fewer jobs at the end, yes.
So the number of employed continues to drop even though the recession is officially over.
Right. Partly
how can that happen economically? How did that?
Well, partly because you got to remember for example, last month, in February, the report said we created 192,000 jobs, and that's true. But you start from the fact that you have about 110 to 120,000 new people coming into the labor force each month. So part of that is just taking care of new labor force entrants. So we created basically 80,000 new jobs. When you're talking about having 13.7 million people officially unemployed, it would take you at 80,000 a month 14 years to get those people all employed, and we've never had an economic expansion that's lasted any close to 14 years. What is happening is you see the portion of the population classified as not in the labor force growing.
And those would be people who have given up looking?
They may be people in college. They may be people who decided they're going to go home and be a house husband or a housewife. And they may have completely given up too.
Or gone back to graduate school, gone back to get more education. Right. But still, if the economy is growing, how is it that the unemployment number continues to go up? Are more people, even if you're adding jobs, yet there are more people unemployed now? Is that just that we've changed the way we count? Or is it just because of the influx of new job entrants every month?
There's a couple of things. One, yes, there are new job entrants. But secondly, in addition to that 13.7 million officially unemployed, there are another 6.2 million who are classified as discouraged workers. That is, they haven't looked for a job in the 4 weeks prior to the report. So they're not classified as officially unemployed. What usually happens when an economy turns around, and this hasn't happened yet, is that those people start coming back actively looking for jobs so that the number unemployed and the unemployment rate can actually go up at the beginning of a turnaround.
Oh, because the discouraged come back into the workforce and start looking for jobs,
right.
So the actual number appears to increase, even though it really was larger than was measured to begin with.
Right.
So you're just measuring it more of it now.
And then I was at a demonstration today where two people are talking to are called 99ers. They've gone through more than 90. So they aren't counted, even though they are just as unemployed as they were 50 weeks ago.
Oh, is that true? If you've exhausted all your unemployment benefits, which is what happens after 99 weeks,
and you aren't looking, you don't look for a job in the 4 weeks
then
prior,
you just drop off the statistics altogether.
Right.
But you're still out there. You're still alive and well,
right.
or not so
right.
well.
Right. The other thing that's happening that is, I think, should be of equal concern in terms of understanding what's different about this recovery is that if you look at the jobs that were lost, about a quarter of them were in what we call low-wage industries, but about half of the jobs that have been created since the end of the Great Recession, the official end, are in those same low-wage industries. So the kind of jobs we're creating are not the kind of jobs we lost. Secondly, a significant portion of the new jobs we've created are temporary, are classified as temporary work. So we are not really building an economy that's for the long run that's going to serve most of our people very well. The average wage of new jobs is lower than the ones that were lost, and temp work isn't something you can rely on.
Well, how is that being fueled? What are the economic forces that are moving behind this that push the wages down, that allow or create the conditions where there are more low-wage jobs created rather than the high-wage jobs, especially in light of what we read so much about the new information economy, where skilled workers are going to be more in demand, where it's about what you learn and more education can help you to get these better jobs. So what countervailing forces are creating this shift towards lower-end wages?
Well, let me take one example, and then I'll try to make a general statement. Apple Computer employs about 275,000 people. Only 25,000 are employed in the U.S. The rest are employed somewhere else in the world, very heavily in China. What we've seen, if you look at the group of companies that are considered officially multinational corporations, which are only about 1% of total U.S. businesses, they employ overall about 33 million people. But now about a third of those people are abroad, and that has shifted. What has happened is the employment at home has been declining and employment abroad has been growing. So you've got companies that are who will generate economic growth, but the economic growth may not accrue much to people in the United States. So that's one of the things that's going on. Secondly, I've been very skeptical about this demand for skilled workers, because if you look at the unemployed, or you look at by industry, you don't find industries in which there's a shortage of high-skilled workers, and they're not industries in which the wage and salary levels are being bid up. So we don't at this point have a shortage of skilled workers. We have a shortage of good jobs. Well,
but still, other than the internationalization, which I think clearly plays a big role, if the good jobs are moving overseas, those jobs, I assume they move overseas because they have to pay less overseas. A good example would be in the technology industry, where high-tech programming software services move to India, a high-tech center. But aren't there more jobs being created at the high end, or why aren't there more jobs being created at the high end? I mean, I accept the fact that there is no, since those wages are not being bid up, it means there's no shortage of those workers. But why aren't those jobs being created here? Because of globalization, or are there other forces at work?
Largely because of the way we've globalized. Let me give you a contrast. Here, we have tended to outsource high-wage manufacturing jobs, for example. In Germany, in contrast, Siemens, which is sort of their equivalent of General Electric, reached an agreement with the major union there that they would keep a certain number of jobs at home in Germany. Same thing with BMW. They reached a similar agreement. So what we have here is that business is so much more powerful than employees, than workers, so it's much easier for our businesses to move things abroad and to drive down wages at home. If you contrast that with some other countries in Western Europe, where you've got this more of a cooperative relationship between usually unions and large employers, and you don't see that same kind of shift. So people say, for example, well, the U.S. needs to lower its wages to be competitive economically in terms of exports. But if you look at Germany, the second most effective exporter in the world, and actually the most effective, the second largest exporter in the world, they have their wages are higher than ours, and yet they still are very successful in terms of exporting jobs. Exporting goods.
No, we're good at exporting jobs.
Yeah, we're good at exporting jobs. Right. That's the one thing we're best at. I think the other thing is that we have relied very much on finance and financialization as our hopeful growth engine. And there are obviously some very high wage and salary jobs in finance. We read about them periodically, but there's not a lot of them. So they create a few of them, and most of the people in finance do reasonably well, but they're not the kind of jobs that are going to. It's not a labor intensive.
It's not the hedge fund managers.
They're not hedge fund managers.
Billions per year.
It's not a labor intensive industry, so they're not going to create a lot of jobs. Ironically, if you look and you think about what's been going on around this country, you look at where the demand for higher educated labor is. It's actually in the public sector. If you look at each of the states where you've got this conflict between governors and public sector unions, take Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, 59% of the public sector workers have a college degree. 30% of the private sector workers do.
So those jobs that would require those kinds of degrees just aren't being created, in this example, in Wisconsin. They're not being created. Now, do we know the historical background of that? Has that been a shift? Was there a time in recent decades, maybe post-World War II, where the majority of these higher educated people were finding jobs in the private sector rather than public?
Certainly at one point. I'm not sure how far back you'd have to go, but at one point that was the case, yes. But that hasn't been the case. That hasn't been true for some time. And if you look at the premium to going to college, and I want your viewers to be clear what I'm saying, it still pays to go to college. You'll do better than if you don't go to college. But if you look at the premium for college-educated workers in terms of their salaries versus high school-educated workers, it hasn't grown.
But the cost of college have skyrocketed.
The cost of college has grown. You still do better if you can get through college, but the gap has not grown. It used to be a gap that's growing, but it hasn't been a growing gap now.
Well, so what's the kind of, how do you look at solutions to this? What role should government play? What role, or is it a government versus private sector solution? Because at some point, if the private sector isn't creating these jobs and government is, there would be many who would argue that it's not the government's job to provide direct employment to people, but it's to create the conditions under which employment would grow in the private sector. But in any case, how does that problem get solved? Who steps in? Is it the government? Is it private sector? And if so, what policies do they need to bring to the table?
I think what we've seen, I would argue, and all of us in CPEG would argue, that the private sector has failed not just in the Great Recession, but over the longer term. Let me just give you two examples or two pieces of information, and then I'll try to answer your larger question. If you divide the U.S. experience after World War II into two periods, from 1945 to 1975, 360 months, you find that in 75 of those months, the unemployment rate was less than 4%. Since then, 420 months, 5 months, it's been less than 4%. So the private sector has failed to create the demand, failed to create jobs, much less good jobs, over a long period of time. We're sort of aware of it now because of the Great Recession, but this is not something that just happened in 2007 and 2008.
Well, what happened in 1975 or in that range that caused this shift?
There was a significant, conservatives call it deregulation. I would call it change in regulation in terms of how industries were, what the relationship was with the government. And of course, there was, beginning with Reagan's attack on the air traffic controllers, a concerted attack on unionization, particularly in the private sector. I think what we're seeing now is the attack on unionization in the public sector, but the attack on unionization in the private sector has been going on now for 30-some years. And that's why you have unionization in the private sector down to about 7% of the private sector workforce. So to your question, who should step in? It's always seemed to me that the primary criterion on which you should judge an economy is, does it create living wage jobs for its population, for everybody who's willing and able to work? And the answer for us is it has not been able to do so. If the private sector can't do it, then you need to turn to government, to the state, to do it. There is, by the way, a nice piece of legislation that Representative John Conyers out of Detroit has proposed. It creates jobs. It's a jobs bill, but unlike some of the jobs bills we've seen in the past where they would say 100 million jobs, 50 million jobs, 25 million jobs, whatever, it says we'll create jobs and we'll fund the jobs by taxing the finance sector. We'll fund the jobs by a tax on the trading of stocks, bonds, and currencies. So it does, I think it does things very well. It says, where's the money? The money's in finance. What do we need to use it for? We need to use it for jobs. And the jobs that he proposes to create are, in many respects, like the jobs that Harry Hopkins created in the 1930s. That is, the jobs that put people to work very quickly. You don't have to spend a year and a half learning how to do the job. So he talks about, in this bill, about refurbishing schools, hospitals, about expanding educational centers, about training for CNAs, and about rehabilitating neighborhoods that have been hit very hard by foreclosures. He's got all these kinds of jobs that put people to work fairly quickly. And then sort of the second tier are jobs in the area of infrastructure, the construction jobs that we're all familiar with. There are two other nice things about it. One, the bill suggests that the target to get these new jobs should be people who are either long-term unemployed. And by the way, we are at a record in terms of long-term unemployed as a percentage of total unemployed. We're running about 45% of total unemployed are long-term. That is over 26 weeks. Mm-hmm. And
that's the government definition, right?
Government definition, long-term.
Beyond 26 weeks is considered long-term.
And it also says that nobody who's hired in this program should be taking the place of somebody who already has a job. Because, of course, one of the risks you always have when you create this is, okay, we'll push somebody else out, put somebody else in, maybe we'll pay them lower wages. So this is a nice piece of legislation. It's H.R. 870. And it's something that a lot of us are talking about trying to build some kind of mobilization around. It's going to be hard given the Republican Congress.
Well, I would also wonder about that particular legislation. The finance industry, of course, has been responsible, as you mentioned, for much of the growth in the last few decades. But finance is extremely mobile. Finance can be moved from one country to another with very little effort because there's no manufacturing, there's really no facilities to move. It's just a matter of moving some brain power from one place to another. So if there were taxes on these financial transactions, wouldn't that be a spur simply to move more jobs overseas?
Let me say two things. One, if you trade stocks, and I'll take that as something that our audience might be most familiar with, all stocks that are traded, they can be traded in a lot of venues. They can be traded in the New York Stock Exchange, on NASDAQ, in Chicago, and Philadelphia, in various kinds of electronic dark pools. But they all clear at one place. That is, when you and I do a trade through our brokers, at the end of the day, the trade is going to be matched and cleared through something called the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. That's where you levy the tax.
And that
can't be moved.
A United States institution.
It's a United States institution. It's recognized under U.S. law.
But you could clear those transactions in a European clearinghouse.
Only if you and I both went to the European clearinghouse. And the thing about doing that is if I buy IBM stock from you and we clear through the European clearinghouse, and now I sell my IBM stock to somebody else and they want to clear through the Depository Trust and Clearing, I now have both a long position, I bought it from you, and a short position, I sold it to somebody else because the stock's not fungible across those two clearinghouses. Secondly, give you a good piece of encouraging information. Just the other day, earlier this month, the European Parliament passed a piece of legislation calling for a financial transaction tax in Europe.
In Europe?
In Europe. They don't, then the European Parliament does not have taxing powers in the individual countries, but they now turn it over to the individual countries to come up with what they're going to do. The French, and I have to admit I have a little trouble figuring this out because Sarkozy is a conservative, but the French, in particular President Sarkozy of France, is very big on this financial transaction tax.
Well, perhaps because he recognizes that the money has to come from somewhere, and it has to come from where the money is, yes, which is the financial industry. Well, so let's segue for a moment away from the specifics of the financial taxes, but to talk about policy in general. There's, as you know, there's a tremendous move afoot to try to cut spending at every government level. And we see it, that was part of the Wisconsin argument, it's been part of many of the state government arguments. And the Republicans in Congress in Washington today are looking to cut $100 billion. Economists such as Paul Krugman will argue that's the worst thing that could be done because it's the opposite of what should be done. We should be still spending stimulus dollars in order to create new jobs and to create private sector opportunities. So what's going on here, and why is this a good or bad idea? And before you answer, one analogy that we hear on the news media all the time, and that is if I am, as an individual, if I lose my job and I have less money to spend, or for whatever reason my financial position deteriorates, I naturally spend less, and that makes perfect sense. I should spend less. I have less disposable income. And I can get my house in order by cutting my expenditures dramatically. Why is that not true about governments? Why shouldn't they follow the same model?
Hold that thought, I'll come back to it. But let me say first, in terms of dealing with the deficit, if somebody says to you, we're concerned about the deficit, we want to work on balancing the budget, the first thing you should say to them, I think, is, okay, let's start by collecting all the taxes that are owed. The most recent report of the IRS Oversight Board calculates that about $290 billion, it's a billion with a B, in terms of federal taxes were not collected for the year, the last year they did the analysis, 2008.
From where? Corporations, individuals?
This is individuals. This is the individual income tax.
And why? Because of lack of enforcement?
Not enough enforcement, and most of that comes not from the people who get just a wage and salary income, and because that's turned in on your W-2 form, you really can't misrepresent what you got paid by your employer. It's concentrated in households who receive more than $100,000 in income a year, and they get it from a variety of sources. So there's all this underreporting. So that's a place to start.
Capital gains, sale of
capital
real estate,
gains, proprietary income, all sorts of stuff like that. That's a place to start. But we'll go on to your next point. Economists speak of something called the multiplier effect. But let me just try to talk it in plain English. Let's say I decide, well, I can't afford to employ you anymore, Kevin, so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to lay you off. So you go away, and like you just said, you stop spending money. You spend less money. That means that somebody else you're not buying some clothes, some TV, some cars, you're not going out to eat, whatever. So those businesses now that don't have as much customer, they don't have as much money flowing in, so they have to lay somebody else off. And that person also then cuts back in their expenditure, and they then are not buying clothes or gasoline or cars or houses or whatever at other businesses, so they have to lay people off. So that's what we mean when we say multiplier effect works on the downside. Cutting
as well as the upside, if you're growing. Right?
Cutting just reduces the demand in the economy, and it means that businesses are going to be less likely to invest, less likely to hire. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who was one of the people who sort of developed this notion, pointed out that you can actually have an economy that continues to bumble along with unemployed people and idle factory and idle offices, just like we have today.
And that's kind of an equilibrium state where it can continue along that way for quite some time, right?
Yes, it's just that you're leaving those 20 million or so people out of the side of the economy.
And on the other side, there's all this money. And we read about banks that have huge pools of capital to lend but aren't lending because they don't feel that there's no demand for it. Now, let me come back to the austerity. Now, I understand the multiplier effect, and by cutting jobs, cutting spending, cutting government jobs, you're increasing the roles of the unemployed, which has this multiplier effect. But in addition to increasing unemployment, isn't it true that with this kind of austerity, that the let me see if I can phrase this in a way that's going to make sense to me and the audience and to you. So if we've got this situation with this austerity and you continue to push for it, then what is the ultimate outcome of that? Is this the same recipe that we followed in right before the Great Depression under Herbert Hoover? Is this a recipe for further I won't say disaster, but maybe it would be.
I will.
But this is in fact the wrong direction that the policymakers are taking, and if so, how do we explain the fact that there is such political momentum behind this move? Who benefits from this?
First, it is the wrong direction, and it's even worse than Hoover because Hoover actually did try to do a few things. He gets a sort of an unfair bad rap, but yes, it's even worse than Hoover. Why does it happen? There's been a long tradition or a long sort of strand of conservative thought in the U.S. that has wanted to limit the role of government at all levels. And I think what is happening right now is that strand of thought has said, oh, this is a great time to do it. For example, you have people running around saying Social Security causes the deficit. Social Security is irrelevant to the deficit.
Why?
You can't, so under Social Security law, you cannot spend money you don't have. Period.
So this Social Security is self-funding.
Self-funding, right? And it actually has a large surplus. The illustration, I think, of the problem we find ourselves in terms of investment is that in the last quarterly report for corporate profits in late 2009, corporate profits were at a record, the highest quarterly report amount of corporate profits ever in our country's history. And let's take something that was in the news just today. Bank of America was turned down by the Fed from issuing a dividend and doing various other things. Because what was Bank of America actually going to do? Were they going to open new branches and hire people? No. Were they going to maybe renegotiate with some of their mortgage, the people would hold the mortgage for? No. They were going to do two things. They were going to buy back shares and issue a dividend. Buy back shares means primarily people who own large amounts of stock, plus, of course, the corporate executives at Bank of America who own large amounts of stock. And dividend would also go to those same people. So we've got a situation which, and I'll try to conclude with this. It reminds me of what Jack Welch, who was CEO at General Electric, said many years ago. He said, ideally, you'd have all of your plants on a barge. That is to say, I have no loyalty to any particular location, any particular group of people. I'll move it wherever I want to move it. And that's what we find ourselves in this country today. And that's why the private sector is not going to restart this economy. We need this very strong nudge from the public sector.
But isn't this self-defeating at some point, following the multiplier example? If people can't buy what you're selling, you as a corporate owner have to recognize that you won't be able to sell. Your profits will drop because the people who you would sell to can't afford what you're selling. This was Henry Ford's great insight, that he had to pay his workers enough money so they could buy his own cars. Doesn't that ultimately lead the corporations into a bad spot?
To a certain extent, but the markets for our large companies' markets are much more globalized than they were in the 1930s.
They can sell around the planet.
They can sell around the planet. You know, you have this, what, 100, 200 million people in India are said now to be middle class in terms of their consumption patterns, similar amount in China, small compared to the total populations of this country, big in terms of a market. So I think corporate leaders have been very slow to respond in the way that some did in the 30s. Now, there are exceptions. Warren Buffett, for example, that sage of Omaha, as they call it, certainly recognizes that we need to do something different than we're doing. Even Goldman Sachs, in their latest annual report on the economy, has said these things that are being proposed by House Republicans now are going to knock down economic growth. And they haven't said, they don't go down to John Boehner and say, don't do it. They say, but this is our analysis. You're going to hurt the economy by doing it this way.
Well, so what policy prescriptions can we give? I mean, other than the federal government simply creating jobs, it sounds like there's a fundamental shift in the way the economy is working. What kind of policy levers can be pulled to reorient that shift?
I think the federal government needs to embark on an industrial policy in the area of sort of what we call green technology, sort of the technologies of the future, wind turbines, light rail, et cetera. It's ironic that people like Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin, decided they don't want the light rail running up there between Madison and Milwaukee, which would actually put many people to work.
Well, it's similar to Governor Chris Christie in New Jersey, who killed the tunnel between New Jersey and New York.
And the governor in Florida, although I think he may be overridden by his legislature. Now, it's striking that the people in California, including a Republican governor, has said every time this happened, we'll take the money. Let's just build the light rail out here, and they could use it.
Well, the governor of California is a Democrat.
Well, but even Arnold said, we'll take the money. What are the policies? One of the things we need to do is to counter what has been an extreme redistribution of income in this country over the last 30 to 35 years. Put it this way, in 1975, the top 1% of households by income got about 8% of the total income.
About 80.
About 8. Last year, they got about 23%. That's a huge redistribution of income.
Four times the amount.
And what's that possible is that you can speculate in financial markets, you have money to give to political campaigns, and it's not going into investment. We need to go back to our tax system and say, look, as by the way, Representative Jan Schakowsky just proposed the other day, we need to have a tax system that recognizes that the upper incomes, maybe we don't go all the way back to David Eisenhower, but somewhere near there. Under Eisenhower, the top tax bracket was 91% on all income over $400,000, which is roughly $3.2 million today. We need to go back and do that and have higher tax brackets in the upper income and use that to invest in America going forward. It can be investment in purely public goods like infrastructure and roads. It can be investment in our children's future in colleges. As you said a few minutes ago, college is very expensive, and college has become even more expensive. Because investment in young people's education has paid off for us historically. It can be investment in these new technologies of transportation and communication that we see going forward. There's lots of things we could do with it, and we're not broke.
So in summary, we need to get the money from where it exists, so tax the wealthy because they have the money. We can't tax the people who are unemployed.
And they have more of it than they've ever had.
So on that note, actually, Bill, we're already out of time.